Dear colleagues and dear friends of the Center for Security Studies at ETH Zurich, I would like to welcome you to our today's webinar on Corona and the future of the Iran nuclear program. My name is Oliver Trenert, and I'm the head of the think tank at the Center for Security Studies at ETH Zurich. I think the topic is very timely. Many of you of course, know that the whole issue of the Iranian nuclear deal is a topic that goes back to a couple of discussions and many debates years, if not decades ago. But now it's very timely again to discuss this issue because there is some likelihood that in autumn we will see a showdown between the US on the one hand and other participants and members to the UN Security Council and the JCPOA, the so-called Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action to deal with the Iran nuclear deal, on the question of whether so-called snapback sanctions should be triggered, and that if that would occur, that would certainly end the Iran nuclear deal. Today we will discuss this issue with our new colleague Niveen Schepers. She arrived at the CSS just before Switzerland closed its borders due to the corona crisis. She is a researcher in the Swiss and Euro-Atlantic security team of our think tank, and she also, together with myself, coordinates a new set-up international project on the future of arms control. Prior to CSS, she worked for the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London, and she has a BA of the University of Sydney and a double MA from Sciences Po in Paris and the University of Fudan in China. We will have a discussion amongst us, Naveen and myself. It's not so much as a presentation, but it's more a discussion between Naveen and me that would last about 25 to 30 minutes. And then we'll have 15 to 20 minutes followed by discussions and questions that you may pose using the chat modus directly to me, please. And you can pose, of course, your questions either in German or English. Now, the first question that goes to Naveen is a rather broad question, and that is, why do you believe it is so important to keep Iran away from possessing nuclear weapons? After all, there are already 9 nuclear possessor states. North Korea possesses nuclear weapons since a while, and nuclear war still, let's knock on wood, did not take place. So why is it so important to really keep Iran away from nuclear weapons?
First of all, thank you for having me. I would say that keeping Iran away from developing nuclear weapons is quite key to just upholding and maintaining the balance and the stability of the nuclear non-proliferation treaty. As you mentioned, we've already had North Korea withdraw and then develop. I think having a nuclear Iran would deal a very strong blow, if not a deadly blow to the NPT. It would also encourage even further proliferation, especially in the region, which is already very volatile and would be destabilized, I think, even further. It would definitely, I think, create a domino effect as well. Like states like Saudi Arabia have really not been shy to say that should Iran develop nuclear weapons, they would follow suit. I don't think that this world security benefits from having Iran as an example to follow when it comes to proliferation.
So you mentioned two aspects: the NPT, the nuclear non-proliferation regime. We celebrated the 50th anniversary of this treaty this year in March, and your argument would be that there are so many difficulties with this treaty. There's so many problems. There is a debate about nuclear disarmament and many other issues, but you believe that an Iranian nuclear program would be the last nail into the coffin of the NPT.
Maybe not the last nail, but quite a big one. I think not being able to contain an Iranian nuclear program would definitely set an example for other states. I think that's why we've been spending, I think, close to 2 decades now to try and resolve this problem ever since Iran's illicit activities were revealed back in 2003. So,
Mhm. And the second aspect that you mentioned is regional. You believe that other countries would also pursue nuclear weapons program once Iran has showed its ability to build nuclear weapons and would actually build them. And you mentioned Saudi Arabia. Are there other countries too that you would expect to go nuclear
I think
in the
Saudi
region?
Arabia is the at least most obvious example because they, as I said, have been quite public in their declarations. I think others speculate that Turkey might be influenced, the UAE, but I think those are very speculative. I think it would depend very much on how it is perceived and how they calculate it. But Saudi Arabia in particular, for sure.
Hmm. Okay, then fortunately we have a diplomatic accord that was achieved 5 years ago, the so-called JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which is a very complicated document. Could you explain us a bit what this JCPOA is all about, what it contains, and in what way does the JCPOA achieve the goal of preventing Iran from going nuclear?
Of course, I will try and keep it quite brief though, and put up a little slide here to help us out. But the JCPOA, which was signed in 2015, pretty much manages Iran's nuclear latency by imposing a set of strict restrictions on the production of fissile materials, by putting limits on the activities that are related to the two most sensitive technologies, so uranium enrichment and plutonium reprocessing, which, while not expressly forbidden by safeguards, can be diverted for military use. So some of these provisions include limits on the level of enrichment, on the stockpile of enriched uranium, on changing a heavy water reactor that could have produced plutonium into one that produces much less plutonium. Then there's also enhanced verification, monitoring, and inspections provisions that go way beyond what a typical comprehensive safeguards agreement with the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, encompasses. So this includes the implementation of the additional protocol, but also much more access to facilities such as Natanz and Fordow, as well as online enrichment, online monitoring of enrichment seals and such. So this is, again, goes way beyond what other countries are subjected to. The JCPOA itself was operationalized and endorsed through a United Nations Security Council resolution, which lifted the UN sanctions that had been imposed since 2006, as well as EU and US nuclear related sanctions. That's the trade off with Iran, pretty much. You limit your nuclear program, we in turn remove some of the sanctions in order to promote more commercial activities with Iran. And while some of these nuclear restrictions are limited to 10, 15 years, a lot of others are more permanent, like the additional protocol, for instance. But the 10, 15-year time limit, which was imposed, was the result of a compromise aimed at restoring confidence between the parties, but also with the IAEA, at reducing the threat of military conflict, and also promoting the benefits of economic integration. So these 10, 15 years could have also then provided the time necessary to pursue maybe some complementary initiatives to prevent maybe the long-term possibility that Iran could pursue an expansion of its program once some of these restrictions expire. And that was the aim. Had the US not withdrawn from the agreement in 2018, we probably would have been in a very different environment. But as we all know, the situation is very different now than when the treaty was signed close to 5 years ago. And when the US withdrew pretty much against the will of every other party to the treaty, it unilaterally reimposed US sanctions as part of a maximum pressure campaign, which is aimed at bringing Iran to the negotiating table to reach some sort of grand deal that would not only place restrictions on Iran's nuclear activities, but also go beyond and address Iran's destabilizing regional activities, support for proxies, ballistic missile developments, all of which everyone has an interest in negotiating. But the goal of the JCPOA was to address the nuclear file, which was the most urgent and pressing file first, and then lead the way for other negotiations. So just to briefly mention, though, that the mostly secondary sanctions that the US reimposed affect all remaining parties to the deal, which are doing business with the US, but also want to engage in commercial activities with Iran. And their impact has been extremely significant, I think, much more than what was expected, since even the mere threat of sanctions has led most companies to just stop all business with Iran and terminate their contracts. The Iranians, I think, the Iranians waited for a whole year, remained in compliance, and then in May 2019 decided that they would take their own steps to address this inability that they see from the Europeans, but also the Russians and the Chinese to not counter US sanctions. So, because they see it as them not receiving the benefits of the deal.
One of the advantages of the JCPOA undoubtedly is that it provides for more and increased transparency in regards to the Iranian nuclear program. Mm-hmm. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that? What do we really know now about the Iranian nuclear program, what we probably didn't know before?
So I think we just have a lot more access into the two facilities I mentioned in Natanz and Fordow. There's also been, of course, and before the implementation day, which was in January 2016, there had been a long exchange between Iran and the IAEA on past military activities to try and resolve and answer all the various questions that the IAEA might have regarding these pre-2003 activities. So this was, again, a very long process, and the transparency we have today is on all these declared facilities and the enrichment processes that go on, as well as the research.
There was a lot of criticism that and debate about the fact that IAEA inspectors could not have access to sites that would be important to visit. Could you say something about this too?
Yeah, no, of course. So when it comes, you're talking about the sites, the issue today, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So just to then elaborate a little bit further on the different steps that Iran has taken, they have since May 2019 rolled back on some of their commitments when it comes to the level of enrichment, which they have increased. Ooh, I was trying to show you a slide with some of these limits. So they have increased the level of enrichment, for instance. They've increased their stockpile of enriched uranium. There's been activities, research and development activities and enrichment taking place at Fordow. So all these are quite concerning, but not yet necessarily a proliferation risk, although I think the R&D in particular is not necessarily reversible and a bit more worrying. But then, as you mentioned, the JCPOA also provides, makes Iran implement the additional protocol, which provides the IAEA with enhanced access to undeclared facilities. So all this access that's in the JCPOA is for declared facilities. But then with the additional protocol, the IAEA normally is allowed, if it has substantive evidence, to request access to other locations. And so the IAEA has done that following what everyone I believe knows has been, was the theft of Iranian documents related to its past activities by Israeli intelligence. So in 2018, Israeli intelligence went into Iran, stole documents, and then provided them to the IAEA. And based on the analysis, the IAEA's independent analysis of these documents, the IAEA has requested access to sites which are again linked to previous activities pre-2003. And while Iran provided access to 2 of these sites, it has for a year now refuse to provide access to others and refuse to cooperate on this issue. And that's actually really problematic because this pertains to the Iran Safeguard Agreement itself. So in latest developments, we've seen the E3, so the UK, France, and Germany bring forward a resolution at the IAEA Board of Governance calling for Iran to cooperate. And I think if the issue, for instance, is not resolved by September at the next IAEA Board of Governance, we could see again an escalation where the IAEA would refer the case to the Security Council, which would then also again lead to potential reinstatement or just a new resolution putting in place sanctions. So that's one of the most pressing issues at the moment when it comes to the deal itself, as well as just Iran's respect of its safeguards agreement.
The issue of inspections and transparency is one point of criticism often put forward by American experts and observers, as well as government officials, and sometimes also from European and other places. Another point of criticism is the so-called sunset clauses. Mm-hmm. And one of the first sunset clauses we will meet in October. It's on the arms embargo. But could you, before we come to this issue of the arms embargo, could you explain to us a bit more about the sunset clauses, what they are, and also, I mean, what's the purpose of it? Or I mean, it brings us to the question of whether the JCPOA, as we have it, is the best agreement that we could reach with the Iranians, or whether it wouldn't have been better to, for instance, to keep Iran away from uranium enrichment, not only for a certain period of time, but forever.
That would have been ideal, right? But I think that would have also just been impossible. I think the JCPOA, as it is the best deal that could have been had at the time. With I think the restrictions that are in place were the result of a compromise. I think when you're negotiating, you have to reach a compromise, and I think uranium enrichment had been a red line for Iranians from the very beginning. So I think it was pushed for a while, the complete interdiction of uranium enrichment, but it was just going nowhere. And I think with the JCPOA, so some of these sunset clauses, most of them are related to uranium enrichment. So for instance, the limits on the level of enrichment or the stockpiling, all these do expire after 10 to 15 years. There's also some limitations on research and development, which do expire. But what the JCPOA was meant to do, it was never meant to, I think, put in place restrictions forever. Like the goal, and I think it's how it was sold as well to Iran, is to bring Iran back into, I think, a normal status within non-nuclear weapon states to reinstore that confidence. And I think having these measures in place for a certain time would help to do that. And I think would also, and I think the measures that you mentioned of transparency and verification and monitoring, those would still continue. Having, for instance, Iran implement the additional protocol would still provide that access long after the sunset provisions are gone. I don't think it was ever about putting in place forever limits, because that's just not what that's not the compromise that would have worked in any case. But of course, because of how the JCPOA implementation has gone so far, we could argue that a lot of these, we have lost a lot of time, all that time that was meant to instill confidence, to put in place processes, and to also negotiate on the side, perhaps other elements where, I don't know, there could be a regionalization of some issues, more, because I think for Iran, there's also the fact that some countries in the region would not be forbidden from enriching uranium either, so why would it be? But we have lost a lot of time and a lot of the confidence that was the purpose behind the JCPOA, unfortunately.
One other point of criticism of the JCPOA is that it does not include any limits for the Iranian ballistic missile program. Could you say some words about this one?
I think from the very beginning, it was decided that while obviously Iran's missile activities, as well as its support for proxies, are part of Iran's, I think, security strategy, defense strategy, they just couldn't be dealt with together. And that the nuclear file was the most urgent at the time, and the proliferation and destabilization risks it entails were the most urgent to deal with. And so the intent was again to start negotiations on missile developments as well after the JCPOA. Again, this whole process of instilling confidence and setting the stage for other elements has been lost a little bit now. But there was a reason why these files were kept separate. I think having the ballistic missile developments included would have made it probably impossible to negotiate a limit on.
Now the dog is barking in your background, and
Not mine.
US President Trump is barking at the JCPOA since a couple of years now already. And the Europeans, the Russians, and the Chinese, on the other hand, have an interest to keep the JCPOA. What's the situation at this point between the US on the one hand and all the other members of the JCPOA on the other?
I think there's still unity in the remaining parties to the JCPOA. So the EU, France, Germany, the UK, Russia, and China, that the JCPOA is still the best agreement in place, and that until there's something else, or this is still something we want to keep in place. So there's still unity on that front. However, there's been, I think, some disunity in some of the approaches, notably when it comes to the safeguards issue I mentioned. Russia and China voted against the resolution to call on Iran to cooperate. I think it just didn't really work with their own political issues. Well, their political intents within the IAEA, so it's a bit more delicate, I think, because it pertains to, I think, a broader IAEA issue as well. Mm-hmm. But I think the Russians are working as well to try and push Iran to provide the necessary access to the IAEA. And then when it comes to the embargo, which you alluded to already, the Europeans, I think, are kind of stuck again between the US on the one hand, which really wants to extend the embargo indefinitely, preferably forever, without any kind of conditions, and Russia and China, who want the embargo to be lifted as planned because they obviously are potential vendors as well. I think at the moment it's a question of trying to find some form of compromise, some form of restraint. So I think some of the proposals that have been put forward, for instance, involve extending the embargo, but for a very limited amount of time, and only for certain weapons, the more destabilizing weapons, or for instance, having sort of letting the embargo completely expire as planned, but having an informal agreement with Russia and China not to sell some types of weapons to Iran immediately. Like, to be fair, I don't think Russia or China are going to just be jumping at the opportunity. I think because of how important the US has made the issue of the arms embargo, and given their own relationships with the US, I don't think it would be something they would necessarily be pushing for immediately. I think a lot of people are also overestimating the nature of the relationship between China and Iran. I think there's a lot of diplomatic behind closed doors negotiations happening at the moment, with the Europeans really pushing for a compromise, and I really hope that something can be found, because the clock is ticking. And the alternative, as you have also alluded to, is that should there be no measures taken whatsoever on the embargo, the US will likely be pursuing what they see as a bit of a legal argument in which they say that they're still a participant to the JCPOA, even though they withdrew completely, in order to then pursue a snapback mechanism at the level of the Security Council. And that is entirely contested by everyone else, but they might have legal grounding to do so and then force a reinstatement of the snapback sanctions as well.
If that is going to occur, I mean, if the Americans would try to reintroduce or introduce snapback sanctions, first of all, please explain to us a bit what snapback sanctions really are, and then secondly, if that is going to occur, and the other members of the UN Security Council, including all other permanent members of the UN Security Council and the JCPOA participants would not accept this US endeavor to reintroduce these sanctions, these so-called snapback sanctions, that would damage the entire UN system. Could you elaborate on that too a bit? But first of all, explain this as far as it's possible in the short time, what snapback sanctions are according to the JCPOA.
So the JCPOA, well, the United Nations Security Council resolution, which endorses the JCPOA, put in place a measure called the snapback mechanism, which was pretty much planning for cases of Iranian non-compliance. So should Iran be suspected to be in non-compliance with the agreement, any member of the JCPOA could refer the case back to the United Nations Security Council, where a member would then have to veto the non-reimposition of sanction. So pretty much because the US will want to reimpose sanctions, it's sort of it would automatically bring them back in. And so it was phrased in a very peculiar way, which makes it now problematic. Now I've forgotten the second part of your question, but
what are the ramifications for the entire UN Security Council system if the US would like to come back to these snapbacks and the others would disagree?
I think this would pretty much, as you say, like question the whole integrity of the system of Security Council resolutions, because if you can withdraw from an agreement that's endorsed by a resolution, but then still pretend that you can implement it, having this form of selective implementation, I think would encourage then Russia and China to do the same. Like the entire concept of Security Council resolution loses its value and its use entirely. So I think there is the problem is the US has that legal argument because it was never removed as a participant from the JCPOA, but it will be contested. But then, for instance, if they do manage to reimpose, but then no other country wants to respect the resolution, again, what's the point of having the resolution, having the system? So it questions it. I think it goes much further than just the JCPOA itself.
Before I come to the questions that I already see on the screen coming from our participants, thank you for those. One final aspect probably, because after all, we entitled this whole webinar Corona and the Iranian nuclear program.
Yeah.
So we should say something about Corona and Iran. And I think it's related to European activities to, in a way, circumvent US secondary sanctions and provide for humanitarian aid to Iran, and thereby trying to soften the Iranian non-compliance with the JCPOA. Could you elaborate a bit on this too?
Yeah, so when the Corona crisis erupted in Iran in particular, which then became really a hotspot for Corona in the Middle East, the Europeans had just managed to process their first transaction through what's called Instex, so the special purpose vehicle, which is intended to facilitate non-sanctionable transactions between its European members and Iran, notably on humanitarian trade. So while the timing of that first transaction was not really Corona linked, it was seen as this good opportunity to then try and process a lot more transactions, which would help Iran deal with the Corona crisis, because at the same time, there was a lot of criticism that the sanctions that the US had imposed on Iran were impeding Iran's response to the virus. However, the use of Instex pretty much has been limited to that one and only transaction so far. So Corona did not really provide this opportunity to use that instrument to its already very limited potential, unfortunately. Like, we're now seeing a second wave in Iran. And so again, this pressure to use this instrument. So I'm not necessarily familiar with what is impeding all these potential transactions, because I'm sure there is really a will to try and use it, but I'm not necessarily that optimistic about how it can perhaps again create this window of opportunity to try and show European will and support for Iran at, again, a difficult time. It's just very difficult, I think, at the moment.
Thank you so much.